The cold vacuum of space never felt so alive. Jared Klein adjusted his seat in the Arcadia's cramped cockpit, the hum of the ship's aging engines the only sound accompanying him. His cargo bay was empty, another scavenging trip with nothing to show for it. Just another day in paradise, he muttered, tapping a button to engage autopilot. The nav computer displayed a sparse map of the Cori's Nebula, its swirling tendrils of cosmic gas making it a perfect place for smugglers and scavengers to hide. Suddenly, his console crackled. At first, it sounded like static interference from the nebula, but then it sharpened into something else, a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was a scream. Not the kind of scream you'd hear on a horror holovid, but a visceral, mind-piercing cry that resonated deep within his skull. Jared jerked upright, his hands instinctively clutching the armrests. What the hell? The scream came again, louder this time, like a chorus of anguish funneled into a single voice. It wasn't coming from the ship's communication system, it was in his head. He scrambled to check the sensors, his fingers flying over the console. Unidentified distress signal, the computer chirped in its monotone voice. Origin, 2.34 parsecs. Classification, non-human. Jared hesitated. Scavengers rule number 1, never investigate distress signals unless you're prepared to become one yourself. But something about the cry, the raw pain behind it, refused to let him ignore it. Fine, he muttered, overriding the autopilot. The Arcadia veered toward the source of the signal, weaving through dense pockets of glowing nebula gas. The journey felt interminable, the scream growing stronger as he approached. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it carried emotion. Fear. Desperation. A plea. The source was a derelict vessel, a hulking mass of broken metal adrift in the nebula. Its surface was scorched, blackened with carbon scoring and fractured plates. Jared slowed the Arcadia to a crawl, circling the wreck like a shark sizing up its prey. This thing's ancient, he murmured, scanning for life signs. The readings were faint but unmistakable, one occupant. He docked cautiously, his ship's magnetic clamps securing him to the derelict's airlock. Grabbing his pistol and a portable plasma cutter, Jared donned his helmet and stepped into the cold, unlit corridor of the ship. The scream intensified the moment his boots touched the deck. Jared flinched, his free hand clutching his head. All right, I get it. I'm coming, he growled, pushing forward. The interior was a graveyard. Crumpled metal, shattered panels, and skeletal remains of alien bodies littered the hallways. The architecture was unfamiliar, the walls curving in organic patterns that made him feel like he was walking through the ribcage of some massive beast. The scream became a whimper as he descended deeper into the ship. Jared followed the sound, his heart pounding. At last, he entered a chamber bathed in flickering green light. At the center was a girl, at least, she appeared to be a girl. Her silvery skin shimmered under the faint light, her elongated limbs restrained by glowing chains that pulsed with electrical currents. Her hair was like spunlight, flowing even though there was no breeze, and her eyes glowed an eerie green. Jared froze. What in the... Her gaze snapped to him, and the scream in his head stopped. Help! Her voice wasn't audible but resonated directly in his mind. Please, help me. He approached cautiously, his pistol still raised. Who are you? What happened here? Her chains crackled, and she winced. The Kralax. They took me. Her words were fragmented, her voice laced with exhaustion. They made this prison. Jared glanced at the chains. They were unlike anything he'd seen, living metal that shimmered and moved with a mind of its own. His scavenger instincts screamed at him to leave, but the girl's pleading eyes pinned him in place. Hang on, he said, pulling out his plasma cutter. No, she gasped, her voice trembling. The chains. They're alive. They'll... Her words were cut off by a surge of energy that made her cry out. Jared gritted his teeth and switched on the cutter anyway. Hold still, he said, his voice firm. The cutter hissed and sparked as it met the chains, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the chains began to writhe, their metallic tendrils lashing out like serpents. One struck Jared, sending him sprawling to the floor. "Damn it," he shouted, scrambling to his feet. The girl's voice reached him again. "You must destroy their core. And the ship's heart." Jared looked at her, then at the chains. He didn't know why he believed her, but he did. Holstering his cutter, he nodded. "Stay here," he said, and before the chains could retaliate again, he bolted deeper into the ship. As the screams returned, Jared knew one thing for sure: this was no ordinary salvage. The sound of his own labored breathing filled Jared's helmet as he navigated deeper into the derelict vessel, the girl's screams echoing faintly in his mind like a fading heartbeat. He clutched his plasma cutter and pistol tightly, scanning the dim, shifting corridors of the alien ship. The architecture was alive, or seemed like it. The walls pulsed faintly, an eerie bioluminescent glow following him as if the ship were watching his every move. Jared's boots crunched over shards of broken crystal embedded in the floor, remnants of whatever calamity had left this vessel adrift. He reached what he assumed was the ship's core, a massive chamber housing a pulsing, crystalline structure encased in metal scaffolding. Tendrils of glowing, serpentine chains extended from the crystal, winding their way into the bulkheads and the distant chamber where the girl remained imprisoned. "This has got to be it," Jared muttered, stepping closer. The moment he approached, the chains twitched and hissed like living snakes. One lashed out, narrowly missing him as he ducked and rolled behind a chunk of debris. "Okay, not friendly." "Got it." He fired a plasma bolt at the nearest tendril. The chain shuddered, recoiling briefly, but the crystal flared brightly in response, and the tendril snapped back into position, angrier than before. Jared groaned. Of course it wouldn't be that easy. As he fumbled for a solution, Lyra's voice whispered in his mind. "You must sever the chains from their source," she said. "But be careful, the crystal will defend itself." "No kidding," Jared muttered under his breath. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on a console near the crystal. It was a battered, alien contraption, its interface glowing faintly with an array of runes and symbols he couldn't begin to decipher. "Guess I'll wing it," he said, dashing toward the console. The chains reacted violently, thrashing and whipping through the air to block his path. One tendril caught him by the leg, yanking him off his feet. He crashed to the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of him. "Let go, you piece of dash," Jared growled, firing at the tendril with his plasma cutter. It released him with a shriek, but another chain darted toward his chest. Before it could strike, a surge of green energy erupted from the far side of the ship. The chains flinched, retreating momentarily. Jared's head filled with Lyra's strained voice. "I can hold them back, but not for long," she said. "Hurry." Taking the chance, Jared scrambled to the console and started pressing buttons at random. The machine buzzed and chirped, its runes flickering erratically. Come on," he muttered. The crystal began to vibrate, the tendrils thrashing wildly in response. Jared spotted a glowing symbol at the center of the console, a bright red mark that pulsed like a heartbeat. "That looks important," he said, slamming his hand down on it. The room erupted in chaos. The crystal let out a deafening hum, and the chains began to retract violently, snapping back into the core like elastic bands. The ship shook, and Jared barely managed to hold his ground as the crystal cracked, fissures spreading across its surface. "Lyra! Whatever's happening, it's now or never!" Jared shouted. Her voice returned, weaker this time. "I feel it. The chains are breaking." With a final pulse of energy, the crystal exploded into fragments, sending Jared flying against the wall. The impact left him dazed, but the sudden silence was deafening. When he finally staggered to his feet, the chains were gone. Back in the chamber where Lyra had been imprisoned, Jared found her collapsed on the floor. The chains that had bound her were gone, replaced by faint, glowing scars around her wrists and ankles. He knelt beside her, checking for signs of life. Her silvery skin was cool to the touch, her glowing green eyes flickering faintly as they opened. "You did it," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with relief. "Yeah," Jared said, slinging her arm over his shoulder to help her stand. "But we're not out of this yet. Let's get you back to my ship." As they made their way back to the Arcadia, Lyra began to talk, her voice faint but steady. She explained that the chains were not merely restraints, they were conduits of control, a way for the Kralax to manipulate her and others like her. "The Kralax. They took me from my home," she said, her words laced with sorrow. "They bind us, use us as weapons. Or worse." Jared frowned. "And this ship? Was it theirs?" Lyra shook her head. "No. It belonged to my people long ago. We tried to fight them, but we failed." As they reached the airlock, Jared's mind raced. The Kralax were infamous throughout the galaxy, a shadowy force dealing in stolen technology and bioengineered horrors. If they had targeted Lyra's people, there had to be a reason. When they finally boarded the Arcadia, Jared set her down in the co-pilot's seat and began powering up the ship's systems. "Get some rest," he said, glancing at her. She gave him a faint smile. "Thank you, Jared." As the Arcadia launched into the void, Jared couldn't shake the feeling that freeing her had been the easy part. Whatever the Kralax wanted with her, they wouldn't give up easily. Jared sat in the Arcadia's cockpit, his eyes darting between the ship's radar and the endless void of the nebula outside. The faint hum of the engines filled the cabin as he piloted the ship away from the derelict vessel where he had found Lyra. She was resting in the small mid-bay, her silvery skin still streaked with the glowing scars left by the chains. He didn't want to admit it, but unease gnawed at him. The Kralax didn't let go of their prey easily, and now he had a target painted squarely on his back for interfering. The radar pinged. Jared leaned forward, his heart skipping a beat. A single blip appeared on the scanner, then another. Within seconds, the radar was filled with hostile signatures, sleek and angular dots moving with precision toward his ship. "Damn it," Jared muttered. He hit the intercom. "Lyra. We've got company." Her faint voice echoed through the ship. "They found me. They always find me." Jared flipped switches, activating the ship's meager defenses. He wasn't built for combat. The Arcadia was a scavenger ship, not a fighter. But he wasn't going down without a fight. The first Kralax vessel appeared, a dark, predatory shape emerging from the nebula clouds. Its sleek design seemed to absorb the light around it, as if the ship were made of shadows. The moment it locked on, Jared felt a wave of telepathic pressure slam into his mind. It was like claws scraping against his skull, trying to rip his thoughts apart. "Lyra," he groaned, clutching his head. "What the hell is that?" "It's them," she replied, her voice trembling. "Their hunters use psychic waves to disorient prey. I'll try to block it." A moment later, the pressure eased. Jared exhaled shakily as Lyra's voice filled his mind like a protective barrier. "Focus," she said. "I'll shield you as much as I can." The Kralax ships opened fire, their energy weapons slamming into the Arcadia's shields. Sparks flew as the system strained to absorb the damage. Jared maneuvered the ship in tight, evasive loops, returning fire with the few plasma cannons he had. One of his shots clipped a Kralax fighter, sending it spiraling into the nebula. But there were too many of them, and their precision was overwhelming. "We're not going to make it," Jared muttered, sweat dripping down his brow. "No," Lyra's voice said firmly. "You won't make it alone. Let me help." Before he could argue, she appeared in the doorway of the cockpit, her silvery skin glowing faintly. Her eyes were brighter now, blazing with green light as if some dormant energy within her had awakened. "What are you doing?" Jared asked, glancing at her. She raised her hands, the faint scars around her wrists pulsing with energy. I can use what the Kralax gave me. It's dangerous, but it's the only way. Jared hesitated. Lyra, if it's going to hurt you, dash. Pain doesn't matter, she interrupted. Survival does. She stepped forward, placing her hands on the console. The ship's systems surged, every light and monitor flickering as her energy coursed through the ship. Outside, the Kralax vessels faltered, their psychic waves dissipating. Jared watched in awe as a pulse of green energy rippled from the Arcadia, disabling the Kralax fighters in its path. They veered off course, some colliding with each other, others simply shutting down. But the strain was visible on Lyra. Her glow dimmed, and her body trembled as the energy left her. Lyra, that's enough. Jared shouted, grabbing her before she collapsed. She sagged into his arms, her breathing shallow. They'll come again, she whispered. They never stop. Jared tightened his grip. Then we'll stop them first. With the Kralax ships temporarily disabled, Jared plotted a course to a remote moon on the fringes of the nebula. The Arcadia limped through space, its systems barely holding together after the skirmish. As they descended onto the barren moon, Jared set the ship down in a jagged canyon, shielding it from view. The moment the engines powered down, he turned to Lyra, who lay on the mid-bay cot, her glow dim but steady. You've got to explain what just happened, he said. She nodded weakly. The chains. They left something behind. A connection to their energy. I can use it, but only for a short time. It's like wielding a storm. It doesn't belong to me. Jared frowned. And it's killing you, isn't it? Lyra didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. We need a real plan. The Kralax aren't going to stop just because we disabled a few of their ships. Lyra met his gaze, her glowing eyes resolute. Then we have to end it. Destroy their control over me, over all of us. And how do we do that? She hesitated. There's a Kralax overseer who controls the chains. If we can find him, we can end this. But it won't be easy. Jared leaned against the wall, his mind racing. He was a scavenger, not a soldier. But after what he'd seen, he couldn't walk away, not from her, and not from what the Kralax represented. All right, he said, determination hardening his voice. Let's end this. Lyra smiled faintly, the faintest flicker of hope returning to her eyes. The moon's barren surface was as lifeless as the void above, the jagged canyon shielding the Arcadia from prying eyes. Jared and Lyra stood at the base of a craggy cliff, the sky above painted with the faint hues of the nebula. They didn't have much time. Lyra's energy was fading, her silvery skin dim and her glowing green eyes flickering like dying embers. Jared was tense, his fingers twitching against the grip of his pistol. They'll come for you again, won't they? Jared asked. Lyra nodded, her voice soft but steady. They never stop. The overseer. Tyrak. He's the one who bound me, who controls the others. And he's coming here, Jared muttered, checking the charge on his plasma pistol. Lyra tilted her head, gazing at him. You don't have to fight this battle, Jared. It's not yours. Jared let out a short laugh. Yeah, well, I didn't have to answer that distress call either. Look where that got me. Her lips curved into a faint smile. You're not what I expected of a human. Jared chuckled despite himself. That makes two of us. The attack came as expected. The canyon's shadows erupted with activity as Kralax ships descended, their sleek forms blotting out the faint light from above. Jared stood by the Arcadia, his jaw clenched as the sound of boots hitting the ground echoed around them. At the forefront of the Kralax forces was Tyrak, a towering figure encased in gleaming black armor, his cybernetic limbs whirring with precision. His face was hidden behind a helmet, but his voice carried authority and menace. Lyra, Tyrak said, his deep voice reverberating through the canyon. Your escape was an amusing diversion. But it ends now. Lyra stepped forward, her body trembling but her gaze unyielding. I'm not going back. You don't have a choice, Tyrak replied, raising a hand. The air crackled as a psychic wave rippled toward her, but Jared was faster. He fired a shot at Tyrak, the plasma bolt streaking through the air. It struck the Overseer's armor, glancing off harmlessly. Tyrak turned to Jared, his helmet tilting as if in amusement. And you. The human. Brave, but foolish. Yeah, I get that a lot, Jared said, ducking as another wave of energy surged toward him. He rolled behind a boulder, firing at the Kralax soldiers advancing on his position. Meanwhile, Lyra faced Tyrak, her glowing eyes narrowing. You bound me, enslaved me. But I'm stronger than you think. Tyrak laughed, the sound cold and hollow. You're nothing without the chains, and even now, their remnants belong to me. The scars on Lyra's wrists began to glow, the chain's lingering energy sparking violently. She cried out, clutching her arms as the Kralax's control reasserted itself. No! Jared shouted, emerging from cover to fire another shot at Tyrak. This time, the Overseer extended his arm, catching the plasma bolt in a shimmering field of energy. Enough of this, Tyrak said, gesturing toward Jared. Jared was flung backward, slamming into a rock wall. Pain shot through his body as he struggled to stand. Tyrak advanced on Lyra, who was on her knees, the scars now glowing brightly. Come back to me, Lyra, Tyrak said. You were made for this. Her voice was weak but defiant. I wasn't made to be your weapon. Jared's mind raced as he watched Tyrak reach for Lyra. His eyes darted to the small satchel at his side, the explosives he had salvaged from the Arcadia's emergency supplies. Lyra, he shouted, drawing her attention. Can you channel the chain's energy one last time? She looked at him, her expression pained but understanding. Yes. But it will destroy me. Jared gritted his teeth. Not if I destroy him first. He hurled the satchel at Tyrak, the bundle landing near the Overseer's feet. Before Tyrak could react, Jared raised his pistol and fired. The explosion was deafening. The canyon shook as flames and debris erupted around Tyrak, sending the Kralax soldiers scattering. When the dust settled, Tyrak emerged from the rubble, his armor cracked but intact. Is that all? He sneered. Lyra stood, her body trembling but her eyes blazing with renewed strength. No, she said, raising her arms. Green energy surged from her, the remnants of the chain's power coalescing into a brilliant wave. The light engulfed Tyrak, who roared in defiance as the energy tore through him. Jared shielded his eyes as the wave expanded, obliterating the remaining Kralax forces. When the light finally dimmed, Tyrak was gone, and the canyon was silent. Jared rushed to Lyra, who had collapsed to her knees. Her silvery skin was dim, and her breathing was shallow. You did it, he said, his voice choked with relief. You're free. Lyra looked up at him, a faint smile on her lips. We're free, she whispered. He helped her to her feet, supporting her as they made their way back to the Arcadia. The ship was battered but functional, its engines humming softly as they prepared for takeoff. As they ascended into the void, Jared glanced at Lyra, who sat quietly in the co-pilot seat. What now? He asked. She met his gaze, her glowing eyes filled with hope. Now, we find the others. And we free them too. Jared nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Guess we've got work to do. The Arcadia disappeared into the vastness of space, leaving behind the desolate moon and the shadow of the Kralax's control. For the first time in a long while, Jared felt like he was heading toward something brighter, a future worth fighting for.